Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. Thank you for coming indoors on such a glorious day and being with us. And I'm sure we're in for a treat and it'll be very, very worth your while. I'm Ian Golden. I'm Professor of Globalization and Development at Oxford, and previously I was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, where we are. I'm absolutely delighted this morning to welcome Ross Garnaut. Ross, I've known about for a very, very long time. We were trying to remember whether we'd actually met each other because our lives have intersected so many times, but we've all got a bit older in the process. But Ross is really a leading Australian economist who has always been ahead of his time, pushing through great research the policy agenda, which has made a fundamental difference to Australia and actually to the world as well. Ross has worn many hats over his illustrious career, always grounded as a scholar, but he was advisor to Bob Hawke, former Prime Minister of Australia, I think at the time when you liberalized your currency and floated the Australian dollar. He was the Australian ambassador to China. Kevin Rudd, who subsequently became Prime Minister and is now the Australian ambassador in Washington, was one of his junior members of the Beijing embassy at the time. And he's been involved in agricultural trade negotiations over time, which is one of the places we might have met. And more recently was the driving force of the Australian Climate Commission in 2008. Some of you might have heard of Nick Stern's Climate Commission, which was started 2 years earlier, but the Australian one, really thinking deeply about how Australia is going to make its transition in this global context. And we look forward to hearing a little bit about that. And then more recently, Ross has been doing many things, including starting something called the Superpower Institute, which sounds great. A new startup from last year, and we look forward to hearing about what the Superpower Institute is going to be. So I won't take more time. Ross will speak for about 25 minutes. We'll have a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. I'm aware that there are many people online, so thank you for being online. And we'll give you an opportunity as well to pose your questions online through the website. So thanks for coming to Oxford. Ross, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ian, and very good to be in Oxford again. The costs of climate change have become more obvious in recent years. The costs will increase until the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop increasing. That is, until we achieve net zero emissions. The limited progress in reducing global emissions so far has led to commentary that the world will not achieve net zero in the foreseeable future. Perversely, the slow progress so far is used as an argument for reducing effort because net zero is too difficult and costly. Such views are placed in the public discussion without comparing the costs and difficulties of net zero with the costs of disruption to human life, economy, and society that rising temperatures are causing with increasing strength. The technology and economics tell us that we can achieve net zero by 2050 at a cost that is amply justified by the damage that it avoids. But other barriers get in the way. Political pressures from vested interests from the old economy that have slowed progress seem to be intensifying. Technological change in the ways we share information has enhanced the role in policy making of shocking ignorance and diminished that of carefully acquired knowledge. The dominant media influence on climate and energy in the US, UK, and Australia, the Fox Corporation and its sister company News Corp, has doubled down on opposition to effective action, with former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott on the Fox Corporation board. It is a setback that the current US leadership rejects knowledge, from atmospheric physics as comprehensively as knowledge from economics. It is a special challenge now that the new energy trade has to be developed at a time of official US distrust of and diminished participation in open international trade. It is possible that humanity will fail comprehensively with climate change mitigation and live and die with all of the consequences that follow. But there are other favourable developments for the achievement of net zero. Costs for some zero carbon technologies have fallen so far that their adoption is expanding even in countries that are not correcting for market failures from carbon emissions and innovation. Gradual decarbonisation in electricity generation and road transport can now be expected even in the absence of economically rational policy support. Research and development and the beginning of commercialisation of new technologies for major industries thought to be hard to abate are bringing net zero emissions within the reach of standard policies to correct market failures. Steel and liquid transport fuels are amongst the largest high-emitting industries in this position. China, with by far the largest national greenhouse gas emissions and contributing a majority of emissions growth in the 21st century, looks as if it has passed peak emissions and begun the decline half a dozen years ahead of its Paris commitment. It helps the prospect for global net zero that China has emerged as a stunningly low-cost producer of many of the capital goods for the zero carbon transition at a time when international macroeconomic imperatives favour high levels of Chinese investment abroad. Not all countries have the renewable energy resources to utilise new zero carbon technologies. It helps the prospects for net zero that we are starting to understand that the costs of removing emissions can be reduced in countries with poor relative endowments of renewable energy through international trade in zero carbon goods. Yet much of the discussion of decarbonisation of the world economy proceeds as if most goods will be produced in the same places as now. The request from the Oxford Martin School for a title for this lecture came to me while I was reading the recent paper from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, The Climate Paradox. The reset that the Institute has in mind is to shift away from timely achievement of net zero and the established technologies for getting there towards investment in currently high-cost technologies, including carbon capture and storage, mechanical direct air capture and storage, and new forms of nuclear. There is a case for continuing research and development effort in all of the technologies preferred by the Blair Institute, but to shift the emphasis away from lower cost and more completely proven technologies is perverse. The Blair Institute paper has several large flaws. In this lecture, I concentrate on correcting one of them, the implicit premise that goods that are currently made from fossil carbon will continue to be produced in the same places where they are made now. The cost of zero carbon goods would be high and the material standard of living in the world as a whole diminished to a large and unnecessary extent if all industrial inputs and goods continued to be made where they are now. The costs of autarkic approaches to reducing emissions are highest in economies with large production of goods made from fossil carbon and poor opportunities for making them with net zero emissions from domestic resources. Today, these are in Northeast Asia and Europe, the countries where it's difficult to achieve net zero from domestic resources. These economies in Northeast Asia and Europe together account for more than half global carbon emissions and more than 3/4 of hard-to-abate industrial emissions. New patterns of international trade in the zero-carbon economy can greatly reduce the costs of timely achievement of net zero in Northeast Asia, Europe, and other high-income economies with poor endowments of renewable energy resources. The world was a long way into the Industrial Revolution before it was widely understood that foreign trade could remove fossil carbon constraints on industrial development. William Stanley Jevons is distinguished as co-founder of both neoclassical economics and quantitative meteorology. As a young assayer of gold in the Sydney Mint during the first Great Australian Gold Rush, He had the leisure and intellectual capacity to find mathematical patterns in the variations over time in Australian rainfall. He was the first scientific meteorologist. Jevons was best known in his own times for his carefully argued book, The Coal Question, published in 1865. After applying his logical, dexterous and creative mind to many future possibilities, Jevons cautioned that Britain's brilliant prosperity and geo-economic strength depended on its domestic coal resources. These were finite, and at contemporary rates of depletion would become a constraint on development sooner rather than later. I quote the final paragraph of his book. "If we lavishly and boldly push forward in the creation of our riches," he said, "it is hard to overestimate the pitch of beneficial influence to which we may attain in the present. But we have to make the momentous choice between brief greatness and longer continued mediocrity." 1.5 centuries later, we know that Britain lost its global economic and strategic preeminence. We know that the source of the loss was not depletion of its resources of fossil carbon. We now know that economies with almost no coal or gas or oil of their own attained high positions in the global industrial economy. Japan, the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore are extreme examples. Economies without natural endowments of fossil carbon overcame their deficiencies through foreign trade. It took several decades after the Second World War to build the institutions, the trust among businesses, governments and people, and the physical infrastructure that underpins the immense early 21st century trade in fossil carbon. Before the Second World War, it was commonly believed that imperialism was a necessary accompaniment of dependence on foreign energy resources. Building the commercial arrangements took high levels of risky private investment and effective public and private diplomacy sustained over long periods. Established commercial arrangements for the fossil carbon trade are now broadly suitable for the new energy trade, and a lot of the pioneering of the new institutional and commercial arrangements were in the immense Japan-Australia resources trade. The new arrangements will need to be accompanied by changes in understanding about the nature of trade in energy and a new physical infrastructure for international trade. The fossil carbon trade is immense. There have been times in the past half century when the value of international trade in oil, coal and methane gas has exceeded that of all other goods in international trade. As we move to net zero, the old fossil carbon energy trade will decline and then die. The new energy trade will be very different in its countries of origin and composition. It will comprise mainly goods that are inputs into industrial processes, plus manufactured transport fuels. In a world economy with net zero emissions, the scale of the new energy trade may be as large or larger than that of the fossil carbon trade that it replaces. Foreign trade can do as much to ease constraints on industrial development and incomes growth in the zero carbon economy as in the fossil carbon economy. Here I commend and rely heavily on two recent publications from the Superpower Institute, which Ian was kind enough to mention at the beginning. The Institute is a philanthropically financed Australian independent think tank. Its mission is to discover and expand knowledge of the role of international trade in zero carbon goods in achieving timely net zero emissions at the lowest possible cost. It focuses especially on Australia as a superpower of the new energy trade, but the analysis illuminates opportunities for production and export of zero carbon goods from other countries as well. The new energy trade paper from the Institute last November introduces a distinction familiar from standard international economics between traded and non-traded goods. Traded goods are those in which differences in production costs across countries are large compared with the cost of removing the products between countries. Countries compete to supply traded goods at lowest cost. Countries without a comparative advantage in some goods import them. Economically rewarding trade may be restricted by protection. This reduces the material standard of living in the country that lacks comparative advantage and in the rest of the world. Non-traded goods are those for which costs of movement between countries exceed differences in production costs. They are distinguished especially by high international transport costs. Coal and oil are transported across the oceans at low cost compared with the value of the materials in their countries of origin. Methane gas is transported in liquefied form at moderate cost relative to value. In contrast, it costs a great deal to transport renewable energy and the hydrogen made from it across oceans, usually much more than value in their places of origin. Renewable electricity transported under the oceans by transmission lines will generally cost several times as much at the destination as in its place of generation. So will hydrogen made from renewable energy as an industrial input or a store of energy. It follows that the building of a world economy with net zero emissions will involve major changes in the location of global production and trade. There will be transformative shifts in comparative advantage in production of energy, chemical inputs to industry, and industrial output. Different commodities will enter international trade from different sources and with different destinations. This will transform location of manufacturing of iron for steelmaking, aluminium and other metals, green transport fuels, urea and other manufactured chemicals. Comparative advantage in these commodities will be especially strong where relative abundance of renewable energy resources sits alongside relatively rich endowments of complementary resources, mineral oxide for iron, aluminium and other metals production, and sustainably harvested biomass for transport fuels and other chemical manufactures. Production of traded goods currently absorbs the majority of energy used in the global economy. The energy used in producing traded goods and services can be imported through embedding the energy in products. A significant minority of goods and services that require electricity in their production are not traded internationally. These include the lighting and control of temperature for buildings, the charging of electric vehicles, and the use of energy in street lighting, healthcare, and construction. A high proportion of non-traded goods and services requiring energy are powered by electricity. That electricity must be generated locally, whatever the domestic cost. All economies have some resources for generating renewable energy domestically. Even the city economies of Hong Kong and Singapore are home to some solar and wind power generation, albeit on a tiny scale relative to demand. The geographically larger economies of Japan, Korea and Taiwan, while being better endowed with renewable energy than the city economies, would also exhaust their capacity to generate low-cost renewable energy before they had met their requirements for non-traded energy. The economies with the smallest domestic renewable energy resources relative to demand will only be able to meet their requirements for non-traded energy with some use of high-cost technologies. Other countries will be able to meet their requirements of non-traded energy from domestic renewable resources. Whether and the extent to which they become importers or exporters of zero-carbon traded goods with embedded renewable energy depends on the scale of their high-quality renewable energy resources relative to domestic demand. Calculation of relative quantities identify Europe and China as less dependent on imports than Korea and Japan, but as major importers of goods embodying renewable energy. They have high levels of industrial activity and incomes relative to geographic area and renewable energy resources. The relative quantities identify major exporters of goods embodying renewable energy, Australia in particular, and some countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and some lightly populated smaller countries on the west of continents in Mediterranean latitudes. Finnegan at the Superpower Institute in the paper The New Energy Trade estimates that utilisation of economic opportunity could see exports of zero-carbon goods from Australia directly reduce global emissions by 7 to 10%. The upper end of this range is not much below the contribution that will be made by the US reducing its emissions to zero. The contribution to the global abatement effort is more important than the 7 to 10% suggests, as the trade removes the need for domestic production of energy-intensive goods that are particularly hard to abate in Northeast Asia and Europe. The quantitative economics suggests that Australia is likely to be the largest single country exporter, but others together would contribute much more than Australia alone. Finnegan's The New Energy Trade provides much detailed information and analysis. It's available on the web for those who want to dig deeper. In this early stage of global decarbonisation, the comparative disadvantage of densely populated, highly industrialised countries in energy-intensive goods is obscured by the small scale of their output of energy. Current average costs of renewable energy in China and India, for example, are low by world standards. Because they're in the early stages of development, developing their renewable energy resources, they use the highest quality, lowest cost resources. They will move up the supply curve, and the marginal cost of renewable energy will be high as they start to decarbonise their large industrial output. Northeast Asia and Europe and other regions with relatively poor renewable energy resources can remain globally competitive in high-value manufactures, but they can remain competitive in these products only if the value in areas in which they are globally competitive is added to industrial inputs produced in countries with advantages in renewable energy generation. In another more recent paper from the Superpower Institute by Burford and others, put out in just this month, in June this year, Burford and others take a close look at the role of international trade in decarbonisation of the industry with the largest total emissions, iron and steel. Iron and steel production contributes over 8% of global emissions. Over 7 percentage points come from the use of carbon from coal for reduction of iron ore into iron metal in the blast furnace prior to conversion into steel. About 4 percentage points of global emissions come from conversion of ore mined in Australia into iron metal, mostly in Northeast Asia. The decarbonisation of global steel can proceed with currently known technology through increased use of green hydrogen in iron production, alongside increased recycling of scrap, with the scrap and the green iron going into an electric arc furnace. Burford and others show that use of standard approaches to correcting market failures would make zero-carbon steelmaking competitive now with the high emissions alternatives in locations favoured by the lowest cost renewable energy. These places can meet the world's requirements for zero-carbon iron. Some decarbonisation will now proceed simply because technological improvement has reduced the costs of zero-carbon technologies below those of the high emissions alternatives. We've noted that this holds for electricity in regions with good endowments of renewable energy resources. It is becoming the case with electric motor vehicles. The phenomenal reduction in the costs of wind and solar electricity generation and battery storage of power over the past 2 decades have generated optimism that technological improvement will make the zero-carbon alternatives competitive with all or many established carbon-intensive processes once the new approaches are being deployed at scale. However, there is no law of physics, engineering or economics that says that other industries will see similar cost reductions to renewable power generation and storage. We can expect to achieve net zero emissions across the whole economy only if policies are in place in all globally significant economies to correct 2 market failures in the old economy. A correction is required to bring the private costs of operating businesses that generate greenhouse gases emissions into line with the social costs that include the costs that carbon emissions impose on others. And a correction is required to reward businesses which innovate in emissions-reducing technologies for the benefits that they confer on others, and which cannot be captured by the innovating businesses themselves. There's been much discussion of carbon pricing, and I won't say more about that now, except to say that while voluntary efforts to reduce emissions can help, we won't get to net zero with voluntary action. Voluntary action will be no more effective here than it would be in securing the complete public interest in securing optimal levels of funding for defence. We will not get to net zero fast enough without governments providing fiscal support for innovation in the zero carbon technologies. This is because the private investors who introduce the new technologies generate knowledge and other valuable outputs which they can only partially capture for themselves. Many governments over the past 2 decades have moved to correct this market failure rather more than have focused on the emissions market failure. Some Western governments argue that the scale of Chinese support for innovation has been excessive. Excessive or not, it has been to the large advantage of the global mitigation effort and the prospects for timely achievement of net zero in the whole world. More recently, many governments which have done less are increasing their own efforts rather than calling for reduced efforts by China and others. Low cost and timely achievement of net zero requires open international trade. Open trade has come under increasing attack in recent years, culminating in the Trump administration's comprehensive withdrawal from the open, rules-based international trading system. And my concluding remarks focus on that. Open international trade in goods and services has underpinned nearly 8 decades of rising and widely distributed global prosperity. It was lightly governed with an international system built around the GATT and from 1995 the World Trade Organization, with a strong and self-confident United States playing an important leadership role. The system saw the rapid reconstruction of Europe and Japan, the achievement of unprecedented levels of sustained prosperity in the old developed countries, and the absorption of more and more of the developing world into the magnificent processes of modern economic development. These processes reached their greatest height in the first decade of this century, up to the global financial crisis. At the time, I used to describe that period, the first 8 years of this century, as the platinum age of global development. The political foundations for the open trading system frayed in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2007-8. In the US, where the fraying was most severe and consequential, it was driven by a number of things. First, the resentment over the association of large-scale immigration of unskilled workers being associated with the globalization of which open trade was part. There was also the long stagnation of labour disposable incomes contrasting with buoyant corporate profits. There was also the geostrategic challenge associated with China becoming the world's largest economy in purchasing power and the largest trading partner for most countries. Neither of the first 2 drivers were necessary consequences of global development within an open trading system. They were less severe and politically less influential in developed countries that maintained policies to secure more equitable domestic income distribution. Those policies are available to US governments, including to future contestants for political power in the United States. The third driver, that geostrategic contest with China, was not necessarily a cause for major concern in the way it was seen. To the extent that it was a matter for concern, the protectionist response was counterproductive. It accelerated US relative decline as a trading partner for all other countries, and that's proceeding today. US National Security Advisor in the Biden government, Jake Sullivan, identified, quote, small yard, high fence as a principle for restricting trade in areas in which open trade carried legitimate security concerns. So far, that principle has been honoured mainly in the breach. The fraying in the United States culminated in the Trump government's unilateral announcement of large tariffs on all trading partners on Liberation Day, April the 2nd this year. The US withdrawal from the open trading system followed announcements of withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change mitigation and from deliberate efforts to reduce domestic carbon emissions. There are 3 big reasons why we should do all we can to maintain as much as we can of the open trading system after the Trump government's withdrawal. Open trade is important to the continuation of global development. It is important success with climate change mitigation, my theme today. And by keeping the open trading system and the global climate effort alive and productive, we make it much more likely that the US will return in response to the inevitable economic failure of the Trump policies. Much can be done by the rest of us without the US on both open trade and climate if we choose to do it. The rest of the world is now large enough to sustain internationally oriented economic growth in the absence of the United States. The volume of global imports without the United States is now several times larger than the total including the US when China and Southeast Asia embarked upon their strong international growth in the 1980s. If the rest of the world remains as open as it is now to non-discriminatory trade within the rest of the world, trade within the rest of the world can support the continuation of modern economic development and its extension throughout the world, including through the continent of Africa. On climate, the US has made large contributions to the science of atmospheric physics and to early-stage innovation in zero-carbon technologies, as well as the global effort to reduce emissions. I was with Nick Stern in London on Monday, and in a quick bit of arithmetic, we thought that maybe half the global scientific capacity on atmospheric physics is in the United States. Relegation of science in US priorities require others to fill the gap. Emigration of leading scientists to the rest of the world will contribute human resources to scientific and technological research in the rest of the world, but will be effective only with increased funding in other countries. The US now contributes a bit more than 1/8 of total global greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions are falling with the growth of renewable energy and decline of coal, encouraged by new fiscal incentives from the Biden administration and improvements in zero emissions technologies. This momentum will not be broken easily or soon, especially since it is disproportionately strong in Texas and other states that have provided electoral and legislative support for President Trump. The withdrawal of the United States from deliberate efforts to reduce emissions is not crucially important to the global mitigation effort over the next few years. Nor is US withdrawal from cooperative climate action and open international trade necessarily a large setback for growth in trade in zero-carbon goods. The US has large domestic demand for fossil carbon now, and similarly large renewable energy resources for meeting it from locally produced zero-carbon goods. It was always going to be broadly self-sufficient in energy-intensive goods and related industrial inputs in the zero-carbon world economy, as it has been in the world of fossil carbon. The biggest danger from US withdrawal from global cooperation on trade and climate is that its actions and rhetoric will influence others in the same direction. Douglas Irwin's authoritative history of US trade policy tells us that much of the damage from US protection in the 1930s was its influence on other countries' policies through retaliation and emulation. There is a danger that others will follow the US into greater protection or withdraw from climate action. So far, that is not happening. There are some early signs of an opposite tendency. The challenge is for us to keep the open trading system and the cooperative global effort on climate alive for the time being without the United States. Success requires as many countries as possible to avoid new trade discrimination against each other. It requires us to open our markets wider to each other wherever that is possible. It is better if we avoid new barriers to trade with the US itself. We should do what we can to keep alive the WTO and its contribution to an open trading system. We should do what we can to keep alive and make progress within the UN framework for cooperation on climate change. There is merit in formal cooperation amongst like-minded countries seeking to maintain a rules-based open trading system and a cooperative international climate system in the absence of the US. Canada has articulated interest in such cooperation. There have been statements compatible with this idea from the ASEAN countries, Japan, the Republic of Korea, the People's Republic of China, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the European Union, and some of its members, and Scandinavian countries. Do this and we can maintain and increase momentum in global development. Do this and we can make substantial progress in global climate change mitigation. Do this, and we increase the chances that the US will rejoin the global effort on climate change mitigation in time to achieve the goals that all of us agreed in Paris in 2015. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross, for an extremely stimulating and optimistic end to your talk, and to your imploring the world to not follow the US example, but follow its own example and achieve what it set out to achieve in Paris, and of course in other agreements in other areas like trade, like pandemics and so on. So we have about 25 minutes. Let me briefly pose a couple of questions to you, and then we'll open it up. As an Australian, very influential and engaged in Australian policy, what do you see the prospects of Australia following your advice and reducing its exports of iron ore and coal, accepting carbon border adjustments, that's taxes, which embody the carbon content of traded products by importers like the European Union and others, and doing what you would like, very sensibly, them to do?
Well, we're a federal system. The federal Australian government, current government, is committed explicitly to make Australia a superpower of the zero carbon world economy. And that was articulated by Prime Minister Albanese on the night of his first election in 2022, and affirmed on the night of his overwhelming victory in the 2025 election. State governments of both political persuasions have followed, Conservative and Labor have followed similar premises. The federal opposition had been committed to reducing action on climate change and reducing promotion of hydrogen as a vehicle for decarbonisation of industry. So the last election, just last month, was highly consequential, and it gave the Labor Party its equal largest victory in history, equal to John Curtin's government in the wartime election of 1943. So the will is there. There are all sorts of practical issues of policy to deal with to get there. The Labor government in a decade and a half ago did introduce a very effective set of carbon mitigation policies that were working brilliantly. I helped to design those, and I've worked on a lot of policy matters, many of which have been implemented in my life. And very rarely does the economy behave as the economic analysis says it will. Well, this one worked perfectly, but nevertheless, I am quite confident, not for the carbon reasons, but that government was defeated in an election by 2030 by an opposition led by Tony Abbott, who was committed to dismantling effort on climate change. Tony Abbott is probably now as influential globally as he was as Prime Minister, because he's on the main board of News Corp, with the sister company of Fox Corporation in New York. And that strong message that atmospheric physics is rubbish, that economic analysis is rubbish, is still coming from Fox Corporation and News Corporation, and is a headwind. It's not easy to turn good precepts into detailed policy. I think it is more likely than not Australia will get there, not as directly and quickly as I would like, but over time, especially if like-minded countries are doing similar things. And let me say, being in Britain now, that the best surviving sets of policies are the European and the UK mirror of that, including the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and we will all need that type of adjustment. It is not an artificial protectionist trade barrier. It's a global welfare enhancing policy that takes climate into account.
Well, we will, all power to you and the Superpower Institute, but we will watch the coal and iron ore exports from Australia with interest, and hope that they do indeed come down despite the difficulties. I was a little bit surprised by, I think I heard you right, you saying that the marginal cost of renewable power will go up as it's increasingly widely used. For non-economists, that means, well, as we use more of it, it'll become more expensive. I thought the data is pointing very much in the other direction, that there's been a tremendous decline in the marginal cost, the cost of renewables, and that they benefit strongly from the economies of scale, and that as more is used, it'll get cheaper. And the technologies that we use, including the heat pumps and the batteries and the windmills and everything else, will be cheaper, but also that there's likely to be, in some countries, and I just was in Shenzhen in China, 20 million people, absolutely silent, totally electric, driven by nuclear power, that there'll be small modular reactors, that there'll be lots of newer technologies that are incentivized to come on. So did I hear you wrong, or are you saying that the cost of renewables is going to be going up as we use them more widely?
Thanks for the opportunity to clarify something. When I was saying the cost will go up, I'm talking about, sorry for the non-economist, but a supply curve. At any point in time, each country has a supply curve for renewable energy. It's got some high quality renewable energy resources which can produce renewable energy very quickly. And if it produces a lot more, and China is going to need more energy just to decarbonize iron and steel and chemicals, and the rest of the world uses for almost everything. As it goes up the supply curve, it has to bring into existence lower and lower quality resources further away from the main centers of demand. Costs rise. So at any point in time, you've got a rising supply curve. Now, the supply curve is falling over time in all countries, probably more or less at a similar rate in all countries. So a country that has a higher supply curve at one point in time, at that point in time, it's a relatively expensive producer of renewable energy, and it will stay a relatively expensive producer of renewable energy. A country, costs will fall over time, but its cost relative to Namibia or Chile or Australia won't fall over time. And what matters in international trade is comparative advantage at a particular point in time. And so China will, if any country can make nuclear work at low cost, it's China, but the amounts of capital that need to be deployed are so large that I think it's unlikely that globally competitive energy intensive industries will be built on nuclear even in China. Nuclear is an important necessary part of the mix in countries that don't have rich renewable energy resources of their own, and which need to supply some of their non-traded goods at any cost. Nuclear will play a very important role in that. I don't think that, well, things would have to change a lot. Relative costs of nuclear relative to other renewables would have to change a lot for nuclear to become a foundation for globally competitive industry. But just to confirm your main point, Yes, there's been absolutely spectacular reduction in the costs of renewables. In my very elaborate modelling for my review in 2008, after talking to everyone who should know, in this country, in China, in Korea, in the United States, in Germany, in Australia, I built into my modelling a presumption of 3% per annum reduction in costs of solar for a decade. At the time when that came out, I was mostly criticised for over-egging the pudding. We won't get such rapid reduction. Well, in the first 10 years, when I had 3% per annum reduction, there was an 85% fall in the costs of solar. And remarkably, that is continuing. But the countries with the best solar and wind resources will remain cheaper than other countries, even though everyone's costs will be coming down.
Yeah, today we'll have very low cost solar. Great. Now we only have 15 minutes left. Keep your questions short, and Ross, if you could keep your responses short, we'll have time to get through a few. Person over there, then there, then there. Let's gather a few questions if that's okay.
Thanks very much, fellow Aussie here, Dr. Garno, Bill Herditch. In your wonderful work in 2008 for your climate review, you spent a lot of time talking about land-based removals and sequestration. And as the models seem to be going, there's a lot more demand for reductions below the line in terms of sequestration and removal. However, there's a growing chorus against so-called offsets. Can you comment a little bit about the need for drawdown and how that might fit with the whole net zero journey?
Thank you. In the front here. Thank you.
I agree with almost all of what you said, except you implied that electricity trade or electricity transport was expensive. It used to be, but I can understand as an Australian you feel somewhat isolated, but I know that there are plans to build cables to Australia. Could you comment further on that?
Thank you. Person behind that.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Belen and I come from Chile. You talk about the reduction of global emissions around the 7-10% if you include like a zero carbon trade scheme. My question is about the other branch of net zero, about just transition, how this trade scheme will include or how this will respond when countries that are more poor cannot produce or cannot engage into this trade and they keep buying not net zero goods, how the global emissions are going to be.
Okay, let's take those three brief responses, then we'll carry on and also come online.
I continue to think that land-based offsets, the absorption of carbon into plants and soils, it will be very important. The arithmetic was surprising to me when I first looked at it, but there's several times as much carbon in the top metre of soil on Earth as there is in the whole of the atmosphere. And we in Australia, since white settlement, in the large parts of the country subject to intense pastoral activities and agriculture, have reduced the soil carbon in many places by 2/3, often by half. So there's a lot of leverage there. There's a lot that can be done. I think it will be very important. The challenge is to define legitimate, sustainable offsets. And we need more science on that. One of the things the Super Institute is doing is a lot of research on that. Our chief scientist is the chap who played a big hand in the science of the European satellites that are measuring terrestrial carbon. So we hope to make some headway on that. But there's a very large opportunity, but we have to make sure that it's really long-term sequestration. There's a lot of science and technological development before we can do the measurement and accounting at low cost, I think we will do it, but that's a rather urgent matter for scientific and technological research. On the cost of electricity transmission, there's a very big project in Australia, an exciting one, to take solar energy from Northern Australia to Singapore, geared to produce about Singapore's requirements. A higher income city than London, with a population of about 7 million, not much lower than London. So its electricity demand might be similar to London, a third of that being supplied by Australia. But the cost in Singapore will be several times the cost of generating the power in Australia. Now, Singapore is one of those countries with poor renewable energy endowments relative to demand that would simply have to get non-traded energy, have to use the energy domestically, even at very high cost. It will justify that cost. But if the energy is going into manufacturing goods that are competing on a global market, the Singaporean cost won't be able to compete with manufacturing done on top of the solar resource in Australia. Now, it's different in Europe. You've got Morocco just a couple of hundred kilometers across the Mediterranean. You've got more options here, but they will turn out to be of finite scale relative to demand. International transmission of electricity, as I say in my paper, there's a few more words in there than I had time to present, but that will play a role, but I think not a big role in supplying industry that has to compete on global markets. Now, if I understood the question on from the lady from Chile, you're saying what about what will happen to with zero carbon goods being supplied from some countries? How will that sit alongside high carbon goods being produced elsewhere? Was that the question?
Maybe more simple is net zero goods seem to be affordable for rich countries and seem to be like a thriving economy for countries that are rich in renewables and rich able to buy. But what happens with this transition for countries that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, some developing countries are amongst those countries with very rich renewable energy resources, which will have major new export industries. Chile is one of those combinations in the Atacama Desert of marvelous sunlight and reasonable wind at times. A number of developing countries are like that. I mentioned Chile in the written version of the text, Chile and Namibia. For the rest, there will, for densely populated developing countries without rich renewable energy resources, there could be a cost challenge. South Asia, for example. That challenge is becoming less over time with reduction in the cost of renewable technologies, but there will be some increase in cost. Part of the global effort on decarbonisation, part of the movement to net zero will have to involve very deliberate assistance from high-income countries to, especially to poor developing countries with weak renewable energy resources. That has to be part of the story.
We unfortunately are beginning to run out of time. I just want to take two questions quickly from online, if there are. One. And then we're going to have to wrap up. I'm sorry. We'll have to check. Ross, can you stay around for a few minutes afterwards for people to come ask you questions? Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
This is actually a following question from Hedrick. How can developing economies like India participate in a zero carbon trade without compromising the growth?
Yeah. Developing countries have one advantage over developed countries. They can go straight to the new technologies. whereas developed countries have to get rid of an established industrial system that's dependent on fossil carbon. India is surprising itself that the growth of solar is very rapid in India. India's finding that often solar, which is more easily decentralized, it can be done more quickly and cheaply than the big engineering systems that are necessary for big coal-based power station transmission. So India's using the advantage it has from not having to remove a lot of established industry. That's part of the story. In India's neighbor, Pakistan, there has recently been an extraordinary growth in solar. Now, it's particularly well endowed with solar resources, and it has an intimate relationship with China, and so it's getting access to very low-cost capital, but it's an example of what can happen very quickly in a developing country. There'll be quite a lot of developing countries which have versions of the export story that I've explained, and there will be other developing countries which will not be able to sustain development and achieve net zero without a lot of support from the developed world. That's got to be part of the story.
Thanks very much. Well, the Oxford Martin School was established to tackle the biggest challenges of the 21st century, and I think you've done an admirable job in focusing our attention on one of them and also providing solutions to this. So I know if James Martin had been here, he'd be very, very happy with your presentation. If you're interested in the Oxford Martin School activities, look at the events page. Today at 5 o'clock, Professor Richard Susskind is talking about his new book, which is, I can't remember the title, but it's about how to understand AI and the implications. So 5 o'clock today here, and I'll be chairing that too. Ross, thank you so much for coming up to Oxford. Thank you to David for facilitating it, David Vines. And it's been a huge pleasure. We've learnt an enormous amount, and all power to you and the Superpower Institute.
And